So a letter came out in Harper's magazine, signed by a number of public intellectuals, professors, and writers, that goes to discussing the importance of free speech and essentially appears to be a rejection of quote-unquote cancel culture. Now, there was some pushback to this, as some people on the list, like Barry Weiss, like Matty Iglesias, like David Frum, are on there along with important figures that actually stand up to these ideals, like Noam Chomsky. So Chomsky apparently was canceled over this. I don't think he actually is canceled. I mean, he's been canceled for decades in terms of neoliberal institutions. When was the last time you saw Noam Chomsky on MSNBC or CNN? But in terms of the left criticizing Noam Chomsky for being on this letter, I will get to all of this. So I'm going to read through this letter. If you've already read it, you can fast forward through that part. But I'm going to get to the criticisms. I'm going to get to what the real issue is and what we should take from all of this. So first, let me get to the contents of the letter here. It's only 3 paragraphs long, but if you've already read it, you can fast forward now. But here we go. A letter on justice and open debate. Our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Powerful protests for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands for police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and the arts. But this needed reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. As we applaud the first development, we also raise our voices against the second. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world and have a powerful ally in Donald Trump, who represents a real threat to democracy. But resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or coercion, which right-wing demagogues are already exploiting. The democratic inclusion we want can be achieved only if we speak out against the intolerant climate that has set in on all sides. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture, an intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counter speech from all quarters, but it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. More troubling still, institutional leaders, in a spirit of panic damage control, are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, and the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price in greater risk aversion among writers, artists, and journalists who fear for their livelihoods if they depart from the consensus or even lack sufficient zeal and agreement. This stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. The restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. If we won't defend the very thing on which our work depends, we shouldn't expect the public or the state to defend it for us. All right, so this is the piece, and number of names here. I will mention several of them in a minute here. But I have no issue with the contents of the letter itself. Apart from the names on the letter, I have no issue with the contents. I think it is important that people's livelihoods are not threatened because their views differ from the norm or because they are criticized. That said, I also think it's important that the criticism of those views that are expressed are also allowed to exist and cannot be criticized for happening. So when you have somebody, whether it's a professor or a writer, and they're criticized for what they say, if their response to that criticism is, oh, I'm being canceled, well, that person's the problem. They are complaining that they're being criticized. You're not free from criticism. So if there are any issues in terms of these people that signed the letter, which of course, a lot of these people that signed it, that is the issue for them. In fact, let me get to a few names here. So David Frum. David Frum's on this letter somewhere. The only reason David Frum signed this is because he's one of the architects of the Iraq War. He's a former George Bush speechwriter who helped to sell the Iraq War to the American people. And people make the correct argument when David Frum comes out and has a piece out. People make the correct argument that why are we listening to David Frum? Why is David Frum being platformed when he sold millions of people on the Iraq War? Why is David Frum still a person that anybody is listening to? I think that's a fair criticism to make. That isn't to say you should take steps to get him fired, but I think it's fair to make the criticism, why is this guy, why does he have a platform, why does anybody care at all about what he has to say? So people like David Frum, J.K. Rowling, who has been criticized recently for her anti-trans comments, she's on this letter as well. She doesn't care. She doesn't care about lifting up, let's say, left-wing voices in the Washington Post or the New York Times or MSNBC. All J.K. Rowling cares about is that she doesn't want to be criticized for her anti-trans comments. So there are people on this letter that are only there for that reason. Whereas people like Noam Chomsky, Zephyr Teachout, Gloria Steinem, I actually do think they have correct criticisms. They have worries that are founded in fact, and they don't want this approach to free speech where if you are critical of something that somebody says, whether it's a professor, a writer, or whoever, that person should lose their job and, no longer have a career because of it. So Noam Chomsky's been, anybody to criticize Noam Chomsky for being on this letter, you're ridiculous. The issue isn't that Chomsky's on this letter. The issue is that everybody else is on the letter. The issue is that David Frum, J.K. Rowling, Matty Iglesias, who we'll get to in a second here, Barry Weiss, the issue is that they are on the letter. So if the purpose of the letter here is to try and appeal to people on the left, that, let's say, for example, here, the DSA recently canceled a speech from Adolf Reed. It was BS. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but Ben Burgess here has a video. I'll link to this below the video so you can watch his explanation on what went on there. But yeah, when the left goes, like, this is the left going too far in this case. The DSA essentially giving in to criticisms that they are giving Adolf Reed a platform, completely ridiculous. So this cancellation of this speech should not have happened. These things do happen. These sorts of cancellations do happen on the left, and yes, they need to be called out. But you're not going to impact anybody that needs to get that message if you have people like Barry Weiss or David Frum on the letter. It lessens the impact of the letter with those idiots on it. Now, to go through some of the examples here, or other examples. Matty Iglesias. Now, this is just anecdotal for me, but Matty Iglesias blocked me for liking a tweet that was critical of him. This is a guy who signed the letter. He's on this letter talking about the importance of fighting back against cancel culture and all voices need to be heard. This guy blocks everybody. Like, this is so now luckily, in terms of his positions and what, like, I have no real, I'm sure I have criticisms of stuff that he's written, but him as a person, whatever, he has no real institutional power. But just going to show you, like, the mindset of these people, it's more about they don't like being criticized because they'll end up blocking people, even people that like a criticism. But then we get to people like Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss, who has a career built on canceling other people, on trying to cancel professors, trying to get people, trying to cut people out of a job that were supposed to be professors because they didn't like what they had to say. And there are countless examples with Barry Weiss. Here's one. New York Times issues correction after Barry Weiss uses Antifa account run by alt-right trolls to prove left is intolerant. Like, this is this is what Bari Weiss does. Her whole focus is on the left being intolerant. Meanwhile, as I'm also going to mention later, I mean, New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, CNN, how often do you hear actual left-wing voices, socialists, communists? Do they platform any ideas from the actual left? The only person I can think of is Elizabeth Brunig, who works for the New York Times as an op-ed writer. She's the only Democratic socialist that I know of. Maybe there's more, but she's the only prominent Democratic socialist that writes for the New York Times. But for the most part, all the writers, whether it's those publications, other publications, the ones that have prominence in society, that are propped up, those platforms, they only 99% of their hires are capitalists. So to talk about canceling and free speech, the left has been canceled for at least the past 50 years in terms of in these neoliberal institutions that have real power and real say and sway over society. The left has been canceled for at least 50 years. So the issue that people have with the letter that I think is correct, not that Chomsky should be fired, that's dumb, but the actual issue with the letter is the focus appears to be on the left canceling people, as opposed to the fact that the actual power that exists in society is with these massive neoliberal institutions that have canceled the left for decades. But, I mean, there's more with Bari Weiss here. Aaron Bibba here, freelance writer, tweets out, anyway, remember that time Bari Weiss tried to get me fired for my freelance gigs because I swear on Twitter, and then she signed an open letter in Harper saying she was deeply concerned about the trend of people getting fired for saying things people don't like on the internet? Like, again, the hypocrisy. It's the hypocrisy with many of these people that sign that letter that don't actually care about free speech, don't actually care about people being canceled. They care about criticisms that have been lodged at them that they don't like seeing. That's completely, and I mean, there's more. I'm not going to go through this, but I'll link to this article below the video. Bari Weiss has a long history of trying to cancel other people. So understand here that the issue with this letter is that the focus isn't where I think, personally, the focus should be, which is on institutions that have actual power that have been canceling people like Noam Chomsky for decades. So while I agree, yes, if you want to criticize the left and what they've been doing in terms of trying to cancel certain people, yes, I think that should be called out. And I think it's important to have people like, you know, Noam Chomsky, Zephyr Teachout, and Gloria Steinem or others do that. But when you put people on this list that include the names I mentioned, like Frum, J.K. Rowling, Bari Weiss, Matty Iglesias, then it loses all. The letter loses its ability to actually have any convincing argument when those people, those hypocrites, are also on it. Now, I also got to mention, Harper's Magazine apparently has a history of union busting. So, Alex Shepard here. So I guess this means that Harper's won't fire people for forming a union now. So again, this is the kind of canceling that has been going on for decades, that has been accepted canceling. When it comes to, you know, the left criticizing people like Frum or Bari Weiss and calling out their hypocrisy, oh, that's really bad. Can't cancel people. But for decades, with the left being canceled, or with union busters like this putting out a letter talking about the importance of fighting back against cancel culture, I mean, you see how the letter is dripping in hypocrisy for many people that read it and saw the names on that list. So if the letter existed by itself and you only had people like Chomsky on there, I got no issue. The issue is the other people that are on that list and their hypocrisy in being on that letter. But don't lob complaints at Chomsky or Zephyr Teachout or anybody else who actually has, you know, a solid record on these issues. Don't cancel them because they're on the same, because they signed this letter along with, you know, these other idiots. Understand that the issue here is that the other idiots that are on this list is the problem. It's not the people, it's not the good people that signed the letter. It's the people that should not be on the letter. And I very rarely do this, but I forgot to make a point that I wanted to make during this video, so I'm going to make it now. The Iraq War. When it comes to thinking about cancel culture, think about who was allowed to discuss an opposing view to the Iraq War. Who was given that platform? Nobody was given that platform. You only had Knight Ridder and McClatchy actually come out and speak out against the Iraq War and how it was a bad idea. But in terms of the Washington Post, New York Times, USA Today, MSNBC, I mean, go down the list, everybody was beating the war drum. And the only time they ever allowed the anti-war voices on was to mock them. So they would allow Janine Garofalo, a comedian. They would bring her on and try to make fun of her because she was against it, even though she was correct the entire time. One of the few voices actually allowed on television being against the Iraq War. So when you think about cancel culture, think about who actually has been canceled throughout history. It's been left-wing voices calling out capitalists, calling out the military-industrial complex, calling out capitalism in general. So this is the issue with the letter, is that its focus is on these tiny skirmishes on the left, which, yes, I agree, need to be called out. But when it comes to who actually has institutional power and who has already been canceling people for decades, it's been these massive neoliberal institutions that have been canceling the left.